welcome to a unique episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Unique in that I'm kind of just hanging out in my backyard right now waiting for some ribs to smoke. And I thought it might be fun just to host an episode where we just take calls and take a look. There's not really much going on as everybody's kind of quarantined. There are a few things that happened that we can talk about. But just since this is a new setup, there's always the chance that I messed up the audio somehow and people can't hear me. So if you guys get a chance to comment how the audio is, if I'm just talking and no sound is coming out, then let me know and I can fix that. I want to go ahead and put up the number to call in if there's something that's been on your mind as you've been observing things happening while you're sequestered at home, if you're not an essential worker, or while you wait for your next shift as an essential worker, or wait for your state to open up, or if you've been on your way to a protest to try to protest the restrictions of liberty that these quarantines represent. Maybe you can share a little bit of your thoughts about that with the audience, because certainly there is a thread of anti-government sentiment that goes all the way back to Joseph Smith in the church. And so when we live in a day and age where the federal government, the state governments are clamping down on freedom of assembly, freedom of, getting together, religions are perceiving that as an attack on their personal liberty. And if you're a Mormon, your personal liberty is tied up with freedom of religion. And so you may perceive it as an assault on freedom of religion as well. And so we've seen a lot of states have protests over this past weekend where people, in defiance of state ordinances or state restrictions on public gathering, have all gotten together and protested that. So the phone number to call is 210-422-2222 if you would like to share some of your thoughts and musing, then you can do that. All right, so let's see here. I am going to just check on my video. All right, well, that seems to be echoing. Yeah. Okay, so there's a chance that the bandwidth for my computer in my backyard is much less, so the video quality may be significantly impaired on this particular episode, but we'll see what we can do. I just want to make sure my ribs don't burn, because in the past I've gotten sidetracked and they have burnt. And my family's very nice. They always say that they taste good, but I know better. Anyway, so let's see. One thing that did come across recently, which was pretty interesting, is that we've seen our economy kind of grind down to a halt, and a lot of institutions are hurting. This includes, businesses, entire industries such as the restaurant industry. Colleges and universities have also called out for help, saying that they're in dire need, and the government has responded in the form of something called the CARES Act, where taxpayer funds are being distributed to universities to help them make ends meet. And an astute observer on the ex-Mormon Reddit posted a document which was a summary of all the payments that have been made to various institutions. And lo and behold, the Mormon Church has several institutions that actually received quite a bit of money. So let's see if we can dig into that a little bit. Let me pull up the proper tab for it. Let's see, allocations for Section 1804 of the CARES Act. This looks like what we're looking for here. Let me just adjust my window size so it's something that's probably a little bit more proportioned. There we go. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. Well, it looks like we are seeing the name of the university and then the allocation that they are giving. And this is from a official government website from the Department of Education, it looks like. And so we may be able to actually just go in here and search for, let's see here. First we'll start with Brigham Young. So Brigham, not Albright University. Okay, so We've got BYU proper. This is the University of Provo. It's received $32 million, $272,986. So over $32 million for Brigham Young. Then we've got BYU Hawaii that's received just over $2 million. And BYU Idaho that's received $18 million. So that's over $50 million just for those three universities themselves. What else is there? There's LDS Business College. Let's see if they have that there. LDS Business College is another school owned by the university. Let's see if we can find it. Hey, there it is. All right, and LDS Business College, just under $1.5 million. So these owned by the church, which does not pay any taxes and completely keeps its finances secret and hidden, secret and sacred and hidden, is in receipt of over $50 million of this relief. And it's interesting because some of these universities don't have the resources that the church has. And just a few months ago, in the wake of disclosures that the Mormon Church had secret investment funds and an entire investment firm to oversee them, that it had over $124 billion, and that fund itself was something that was built up out of the surpluses of the tithes and various other donations that had been given to the church. The church would take care of its operating expenses and then take the excess and divert it over into this fund, which then grew under their stewardship to over 120 billions. It's probably less than that now. I think some person who was in there crunching the numbers observed that the church had something like $20 million in one particular petroleum company that, in the wake of everything that's going on, just filed for bankruptcy. And so people who sacrificed in their personal lives to give money to the church in the form of tithing saw a bit of that sacrifice disappear in a puff of bankruptcy with that particular organization. But I take this with a grain of salt until somebody goes and produces the numbers on it. But the people who've been digging into this stuff have been pretty reliable so far. And it's not surprising given the type of business failures that we anticipate seeing in the wake of the economic disaster that the coronavirus has wrought on the entire nation. So, it was interesting. I have a friend who's in the restaurant industry, and he observed that there was a program to help small business owners deal with meeting their payroll in the wake of the lockdown that's happened, where people are not purchasing food and going out and visiting restaurants. And so a lot of small mom and pop shops, smaller independent restaurants have really been struggling. And the government came up with a program to the tune of a couple $100 billion to try to help these people out. Well, it turns out that some of these large national franchises with hundreds of locations went in and they actually qualified for that program because it was designed so that it defined big or small based on how many employees you have at one location. And so a McDonald's may be a part of a huge chain, but they may not have that many employees at a particular location, so they might qualify. I don't know if McDonald's went for it. They may not actually be in the same position that other ones, but there were some other larger national chains like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. There was another one called Shake Shack or something like that. And it was disclosed that they had gone in and gotten hundreds of millions of dollars or $10 million out of this program when the program shut down all of a sudden, shutting out a whole bunch of smaller businesses because they were trying to work with their banks, taking a little bit longer. They didn't quite make it in, and then the money ran out. And in the meantime, these larger mega franchises got tens of millions of dollars in assistance when they needed it much less than the small guys. Well, let me see if I can find the article, because one of those companies did something that was quite remarkable. So let's see here. See if I can find. All right, so here we go. Yeah, I think we found it here. We'll go and see if we can bring this up. We'll hit the Chrome tab and we'll see what we got here. Okay, so CNN has decided that it's going to hit me with all kinds of ads. That's great. Can I say no to this? How do you get this crap out of here? Okay, no. Yeah, well, that's happening. All right. CNN. Okay, so Shake Shack. You know, I wonder if they can make those ads any bigger. I had to turn on my ad block or something. Let me just increase the size here and we'll go full screen on this. Okay, so Shake Shack initially received $10 million in these emergency loans. And it decided, once it realized that the funds were not unlimited, and that by taking those $10 million, they were removing $10 million that could go to support a much higher number of smaller businesses. So they decided to return the $10 million loan received from the U.S. government under the emergency program, which was supposed to help small businesses pay workers and keep their operations running during the coronavirus shutdown. The burger chain was initially awarded the loan as part of the PPP, or the Paycheck Protection Program, and it was, that program itself was almost $350 billion of stimulus that ended up running out of money as everybody rushed to get some of those funds. The CEO disclosed their decision to give the money back in an open letter on Monday, which is actually today, saying that the company no longer needed the money because they're fortunate to have access to capital that others do not. So in this case, we have an example of a company showing some degree of a conscience. He further explained that the program was a great opportunity for restaurants to receive funding, but the company changed its mind and returned the loan after hearing that small business owners did not have access to it. It doesn't seem right to us, he said on the CNN newsroom. As we watched this opportunity play out over the weeks, it was very clear that the program was underfunded and wasn't set up for everyone to win. They have around $100 million on cash in hand. And Harlow asked him why they applied for it in the first place, and he said it was aimed at taking care of his workforce and maintaining liquidity. Our team members have equal value to any other team member in the world. It's just interesting because a lot of people, when this was first disclosed that this company, as well as several other larger companies, had received this money, whereas a lot of smaller businesses were closed out of it, there was a lot of righteous indignation and righteous outrage. Certainly small business owners who had been struggling to try to get access to those funds so they could take care of their own workers and have a better chance at staying in business. They protested and called for boycotts on these companies. And so far, that's the only of these mega franchises that has claimed a big part of that pie. It's the only one to come back and say that maybe they should take a different course of action as a larger company that has more resources to draw on. Is there a parallel between this and the church? Well, when it was disclosed that the church had hundreds of billions of dollars, they went into PR mode, and they had some of their I think they had the people involved in the presiding bishopric talk to the media, explain where these monies came from, what they're intended for. And in one of the interviews, the guy who put out as the spokesperson said that this is a rainy day fund. This is for some time in the future where there may be an economic calamity, not the second coming of Christ, but in the times that may lead up to the second coming of Christ, where there's going to be hardships. That's what those funds are for. But what we're seeing in the way that the church is acting is that they are not drawing on those funds where they could. They're instead taking some of the pie that other people who don't have those reserves are drawing from. And they could make the same argument that Shake Shack initially made, which is that, our professors, our school, our resources, they're every bit as important as any other university and their own faculty. So if those universities are drawing on assistance that the government is giving, then we should have a right to do that as well. And I think people may may take that argument and think that it's legitimate. It's just harder to justify when they're sitting on that much money in reserves anyway, that the church could redirect to the university. And the question might come up, well, we don't know if the church can actually use those funds for BYU. Is that even possible? Well, there's a precedent that's been set where the church has used and redirected funds from that Ensign Peak vast hoard of wealth to other purposes, specifically to for-profit enterprises that the church also maintains. Part of the disclosure of the original leak was an assessment that the church had only really used the funds for a couple of instances other than just accumulation. And one of those was to bail out Beneficial Life Insurance, which was a life insurance company that the church previously owned that continues to exist, but it's no longer underwriting any new policies. It's just taking care of the policies that it already has. At one point, I think this was in the 2008 financial recession, it became insolvent, and so the church transferred funds from Ensign Peaks to do that. So there is a precedent that the church is able to make some payouts from its vast hoard of wealth. It's just a matter of how they're going to go about doing that, and we don't really know at this point. So anyway, if you have any thoughts on this, you can call 210-422-2222. I think I've had the phone thing covered up. I don't know if anyone's called. That may not be available. I think I have the audio working for that so that we don't have to shift over. Okay. So in the meantime, let's see what other trouble we can get into until we have anyone that wants to call. We have a couple of comments. Ken Purdy says, it's sad that more of the money didn't go to the right folks. The shutout scenario that you describe happened in my niece's business. Just referring to smaller businesses that are trying to get access to some of the assistance that's going out there, and larger corporations that have more resources to be able to apply for these things are able to acquire the funds because they have more resources to put into the acquisition. Many of you are with Sam Young, who has been an activist in the Mormon space on the issue of trying to improve the church's position with regards to worthiness interviews, and how the way the church has done that in the past has been a setup for abuse, both intentional and unintentional, with children in the church. And he is a small business owner. He owns a paper product company in the Houston, Texas area, and he's been vocal online with his own frustrations on that kind of issue. So we know it's affecting people in their lives. Okay, so one of the things that I do is I'm a member of a couple of Facebook groups. One of them is the Mormon Historian Facebook group, and this group is great. There's a lot of published authors and researchers in the group, and it's always fun to see them exchange ideas, to ask questions of each other, and get into fights. That's the best part of it. There's a couple of curmudgeons in there that just don't take no way from no how, and it's always fun to see them go into it. Well, occasionally you'll get some defenders of the church posting in there, and it always stirs up some stuff. So recently somebody posed a question of Brian Hales about some of the back and forth that Brian Hales has had with Dan Vogel in the past. Dan Vogel ended up doing a series of videos trying to really work through the question of whether or not Joseph actually engaged in polyandry. And polyandry is when you have one woman who may be married at the same time to more than one man. We're all familiar with the term polygamy, and polygamy is a blanket term which just means that somebody may have more than one spouse. That's a very broad general term. A subset of polygamy is going to be polygyny, where a man may have more than one woman as wives. And then there's also polyandry, where a woman may have more than one wife. Well, anyone that's familiar with the Swedish rescue recording. This happened, I don't know, almost a decade ago, where there seemed to be a mass exodus or a mass epidemic of doubt in Sweden. And they sent the church historian and the assistant church historian there to have a secret fireside where everybody who was really troubled by these doubts could get together and ask questions of actual church authorities and put some of those doubts to rest. Well, one of the questions that was asked was, did Joseph Smith marry women who were already married to other men? And Marlon Jensen, who was the church historian at the time, acknowledged the question, described it just as I have in terms of the definition of polyandry, and then admitted that Joseph Smith behaved in both polygyny or polygamy and polyandry. And so for a long time, it was kind of the accepted belief or understanding of people who knew about these goings on that the church was willing to acknowledge that Joseph Smith engaged in polyandry. Well, then enter Brian Hales, because Brian Hales and his research assistant went and tried to dig up all the official source documents, and Brian Hales' conclusion at the end of it was that Joseph did not actually ever engage in polyandry. It was only polygamy. And he backed this up by saying that Joseph taught at multiple instances that a woman to marry multiple men was adultery. And then he carved out a new sort of refined concept, new to many people, although some people claim it's always been there, which is that in the Nauvoo time period, there were eternity-only sealings, and so Joseph might be sealed to a woman who was already married, but that sealing was only to take effect in the eternities. She would still live with her husband in the here and now, and that would not apply. I say that, people kind of say, are you making this up? Is this just a post hoc rationalization, something that we're going to lay on top of the past so that we can better contextualize it now? And I think that's where a lot of the fight comes up. So Johnny Stevenson, who's a friend of mine who's done a lot of research on polygamy, gets into it with Brian Hales, and Brian Hales starts discussing with it. At any rate, it's a private group, so I can't show you a lot of the back and forth, but it raised a lot of this question of, how do we deal with the issue of Joseph Smith's polyandry? And there seem to be a couple of key rationalizations that Brian Hales put out there. One of them is that Joseph didn't have, if he was married to another woman, well, in Doctrine and Covenants section 22, there's a revelation where God says that in bringing about the new and everlasting covenant, that all other covenants were done away with. And so the rationale is then that if Joseph had married a woman who was already married to somebody else, then that new marriage with Joseph immediately invalidated and nullified any past covenant. And so Joseph would not have been marrying a woman who was already married. Her marriage to him nullified any other past woman. So only one husband for that woman, even if she was already previously married. That's a little hard to swallow. That's the same rationale that you heard followers of David Koresh and some other religious charlatans who went in unorthodox directions with marriage. It's not an unusual rationale. Leslie has a question. Who's supposed to call? Are you looking for guests? Anyone can call if you've got something on your mind. If you want to share something with the audience, then please call in. You can call 210-422-2222. I'm just talking a little bit right now about some of the things that came out with the discussion with Brian Hales. The second rationale was that if there's no unambiguous proof that Joseph Smith had any sexual relations with any woman who people claim already had a prior husband, and since there's no unambiguous evidence, then we can just assume that it didn't happen. So there was no sexual dimension to his relationships with these women to whom he was sealed. And as a result, it's not polyandry. And the big question that happened there is, by him saying there's no unambiguous evidence, what he's saying is that even if somebody admitted that they spent the night in the same house on their wedding night with a woman that they were first sealed to. Well, that's still ambiguous because we don't know what happened. We don't. There's no evidence that carnal intercourse actually took place. It's just coincidence they happened to be sleeping at the same place. And so by drawing his definition very, very, very narrowly, then he's able to make an argument that it never happened. And again, it's one of those things where it becomes harder to believe the more you hear him try to make that case. And so I think it'll be interesting in the coming weeks to go through and really dig into this question. And I'm hopeful to get a couple of these people in to talk about it. Brian Hales is a physician himself. He's an anesthesiologist, and I imagine he's probably not in position to discuss it, but I can reach out to him. Let's see. We've got some responses for this. Diamond Melody says, I wonder why the husbands got so upset sometimes then. One of them said he was miserable. And I think that's a reference to Zina Huntington's husband. All right, let's see what we got. We got a call. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. Oh yeah, please do. Before you get further, I need to make sure that you're I don't think that the audience can hear you. Let me just make sure that is working. Okay. Try speaking now.
Okay. Yeah. Hello.
Okay. So, all right. This is part of the problem with having this dual setup. Let me see what I can do. I've got system there, speakers. If I go to microphone.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
Give me just a second if you would. I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear you now. The audience can hear you though.
No problem at all.
Okay, I'm going to have this go out to... I'm going to have this go to A2 as well. All right. Say something.
Yeah, hello?
Okay, I can hear you, and I think the audience can hear you at the same time.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, go ahead and take your call. Or what's your comment?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for taking my call. So I was having this conversation about polyandry, and with a True Believing member, a friend of mine, and he's very, very kind of clueless about the information that's out there about polyandry. And I thought to myself regarding Joseph Smith and the fact that he, that I think there's credible evidence out there to say that he was in a polyandrous relationships. But my question is, isn't Joseph Smith the one prophet who taught that all of these things? Because a lot of members of the church are like, well, he was trying to get married so that he can prepare these things for the future, for the coming of the, of times and all these things and eternity. And I asked myself the question, I said, didn't Joseph Smith himself teach us that all of this would be taken care of in the millennia? Why did he have to establish these polyandrous relationships and all these polygamous relationships in the now if the millennia would have taken care of that anyway? So that is my major question.
That's a good point. And some of that may be that we're looking back on that with explanations that were subsequently given when people raised questions about the logistics of, for example, baptizing natives in South America or in the Amazon who've had no contact with any civilization for a long time. And people are like, well, how do they get their salvation? And then answers, so, well, that stuff that we would take care of in the millennium when we have access to all knowledge. We have principle and idea that's out in the margin that we could have for trying to understand these things. And I think there may be a little bit of that. And people would say, well, our criticism of Joseph on that point is an example of presentism. And I could understand how they might respond that way, but I think there's always the question of, if this was actually the case, then surely the Lord would have told Joseph back when he was stumbling around trying to make all these things work.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just thought that, so a lot of people want to justify these actions when in fact they taught, well, we'll get it taken care of, in the future tense. And I'm just like, well, then why did you do it now? I mean, with offering celestial marriage to these people who knows what other choices they might have made in life that might have taken them in other paths to marry other people in the temple or not. Yeah. And then that promise or those things that he did in the now wouldn't have mattered anyway.
Yeah. I think there's a whole lot of, one of the callers calls it like sidestepping and bullshit, and that goes on when Joseph's trying to do what he does. And we look back on it now and it's like, that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, if these other things that come out are true and real, they were true and real back then, and you could just make sense of it then. I mean, even just the whole notion, a lot of people say, well, his marriage to Helen Mar Kimball, the 15-year-old, it's because he was old and she was young. That's the worst part of it. Well, for me, the worst part of it is not the age disparity. It's the fact that he had to, she initially refused, and it was only when he offered the exchange of the salvation of her whole family's household. And suddenly it places on this 14-year-old girl the weight of her family's salvation as to whether or not she accepts a proposal. And, we know now that, for anyone, if President Nelson came to you and you had a young daughter and he said, I need you to let me be sealed to her. I'm not going to sleep with her, but I'm going to be sealed to her for the eternities, knowing that that's going to eliminate her options for a spouse in this life anyway. We would just see that as completely immoral and reprehensible. And it's no less so back then. But that's the reason that.
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I look forward to the day that maybe one of the apologists, like the ones that you having an explanation to the video of, which is great, by the way. Maybe a Kwaku can be on the show, and then we can have an intelligent conversation about all this.
I don't know that I've ever heard Kwaku talk about polygamy in depth. That would be interesting to see if he's examined that chapter in the church's history and what he makes of it.
I would love to see that, but thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thanks for the call.
Take care. Bye-bye.
It's interesting when you listen to church apologists try to rationalize some of the things that they do. The arguments seem to hold up to the believing mind because you already presuppose Joseph Smith to be the prophet. And so any explanation which seems to increase the credibility of something that Joseph would do, you latch onto that really quickly. And it may seem good, but then it's always weird to hear it come out of a defender of a different prophet trying to speak on the same things. And this really jumped out to me when I was watching a video of an apologist for the prophet Muhammad on his child brides. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Let me just make sure things, microphone, yes. Ringing, speakers, yes, that should work. That doesn't seem to be working. Hold on. All right, I'm having some audio problems. Let's see here. That should be working. That should be working. Okay. Try calling back. We'll see if we can get it working here in a little bit. Okay, that should work fine. The speakers. should be. Let's see if we can get the speakers out through that. All right, see, can you hear me now? All right, hold up. I can't hear you, so I'm going to have to change something. I thought I had it fixed. Just give me a second. Okay, voice meter audio. Is the speaker. If I hit test, it gives me audio there. And if I come over here, headphones, hands-free, that should speak there. Let's go into A2, A2. Well, that's frustrating. Let me see what I can do to fix this in other ways. If I bring this to just default. All right, well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to fix some of this audio issues real quick. Let me see what I can do. Hold on just a second. Okay. Speakers. Test. That's not working. I'm going to hit refresh. All right. And that's hitting auxiliary. Going to A2 and A1. A1 is going to all right, I think all right. Now that goes to A1. A1 A2. Okay. Well, that's really frustrating. All right, well, I think I may have another solution, but it's going to involve me having to hit share screen here real quick with the voice and share audio and do that and then go right back to this. Okay, and I think if we do that, all right, if you want to try calling back in, we'll see if we can get it to work. And I'll just do this to default. Boop. Okay, hopefully that'll work for us then. Okay, well, give it a try, give it a shot. Let's see here. All right, this is Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, right. I can hear you too. Okay, hopefully the audience can hear, but we'll see how that goes.
Yep, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Firstly, I am so excited that I finally get to call in. Every time I've tried to listen, I've always missed a live, so I'm really happy to talk to you. It's interesting you bring up the polyandry and the polygamy. I'm half in, half out right now. Mm-hmm. And the polygamy, I don't mind. I don't care what people do with their lives. You know, it's their choice if they would like to be in a polyamorous relationship. And that's interestingly like not what broke or is breaking my shelf, but I feel like it's a betrayal of knowledge and information about it. I feel like I've been gaslighted. Like, no, it was all there for you to find. Except when I was investigating the church, I was told, no, you shouldn't go anywhere other than LDS.org to find the information about the church. Everywhere else is, anti.
Yeah.
So I was, like, oh, okay then. Well, I'll go do that. And, nothing much on polygamy or anything like that. And then only recently I found the gospel topic essays, and I looked at the date, and it was the polygamy, I think, in Kirtland and Nauvoo was published 1 month before I was baptized. No, 1 month after I was baptized, actually. 1 month after.
You were a new convert, like really new.
I was really new, and family members and friends had brought me all of this stuff to read, and I was like, no, that's stuff we've gotten off the internet, of non-credible sites. Like, I'm just going to stick to what I've been told, because people are saying, and I was learning, like, my family thought, they're Mormons are happy clappers, there were some misconceptions about their religion. So I was already on the path of, well, some people are really misinformed, and I'm learning some really great stuff. And, sure, there might have been polygamy, but it was for the widows. That's what I was told. And
how would it have changed things for you? Because it sounds like when the missionaries brought the gospel discussions to you, they weren't forthright about the nature and extent of Joseph Smith's polygamy early in the day. If going into it, when you were first given those discussions, if they said the prophet restored a lot of things, and one of the things early on the church that it was restored was polygamy, and that included in some cases him being married to women who were already married, like, how would you have accepted that? Would you have contextualized it and said, oh, well, that's just part of the restoration? Or would that have been a huge red flag?
Yeah. I think, so I wasn't actually taught by a missionary, by full-time missionaries. I don't want to say too much, but it was not a missionary full-time. Someone who I loved and I trusted. And the thing is that they didn't lie to me. They only knew what they were told. So I think if someone had told me what you had just told me, I probably would have been like, well, it was what it was, and it doesn't affect me now, and they're not saying that I'm going to need to practice polygamy.
Not in this life.
Right. Not in this life. And that's another thing that gets me too, because, again, I'm not going to go into too much information, but I've lost someone, and to think that I can't be with them because I disagree with having or being a part of a polygamous relationship in the afterlife, or I drink coffee. There are things that don't make sense, and unfortunately it's kind of like a spider's web. One thing connects to another, and I feel like you can't take one without taking something else. Nothing in the LDS Church is a singular concept. I feel like they're all kind of embedded into another one, and I think that's what makes people feel really guilty about having doubts or choosing to leave.
No, I totally agree with you. It's like you it seems like it's a bunch of happy, fun people, and you join, and then suddenly you're in the not even one club. I don't know if you've seen this book. It's written by the woman who is the wife of the prophet, but it's a children's book, and it just tells the story of a kid who, wants to be part of the club, but then realize that they have all like made this oath not to do anything like drink coffee or tea, not even once. And so just like the implications of how that then deals with somebody trying to live their life and dealing with, just normal stuff in life. It creates this toxic perfectionism that you don't realize. You just think you're joining a group of happy people, but there's all of these cultural expectations and all of this pressure that comes along with it that it's almost impossible to know what it's like until you live through it. Like, did you get to the point, since you're a relatively recent convert, where you actually went to the temple? Did you get to experience the temple ceremony?
Yes. Yes,
What was your impression of that?
I'm going to be honest with you, I thought it was weird. It was really weird. And I wasn't quite expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, because no one told me anything about it. you know, I got to learn it. Like my temple prep class was about scriptures and reading about Genesis and the creation and stuff. And then you go in there and to me, it seems on the outside like that's what it is. But then you go to the next room and it's not about that anymore.
Yeah.
It's about covenanting to give all that you have to the church, not to the kingdom of God, you know. And I can't believe me as I used to be, and I am now, a critical thinker, thought that was okay to kind of say yes to something without reading about it. And something interesting that's happened lately is my partner asked me to do something for him, and I didn't just say yes. I said, "What is it?" Like I'm not just going to say yes. Like what happens?
I fell for that once already.
Do it or don't.
And
You know,
what some of the viewers may not know you're alluding to, when you go through the temple, if any of the viewers haven't been through the temple, at one point early on, the voice that's speaking to you says, if anybody here isn't willing to commit to everything in this ceremony, then raise your hand and we can let you leave now. So you're basically committing to do whatever it is that they're going to present to you in the temple, even before you know what it's going to be. And it's so wrong. And I see that now, but like you, I didn't see it at the time.
Yeah, and not to mention you have all the added pressure of, you know, if you're there, you know, for your first endowment, you're there with a mother or a mother-in-law and all your family or in-laws' family. It's like,
and they're acting like it's normal.
You don't feel comfortable. Yeah, and you don't feel comfortable to be like, nope.
Yeah.
I'm noping out of here before it's even started, you know. And then, of course, it's, you know, the curiosity of man is like, well, what's going to happen next? It seems like a pretty big deal if they're going to offer that as a caveat, you know. So yeah, just some interesting things that and as a convert, I feel like, you know, I'm able to go back to my critical thinking hat because I've lived both sides, you know. And I mean, I moved to Utah, so I had been in the thick of the cultural and the doctrinal and how they all kind of intermingle, and so yeah, it's just been interesting. So I really like I love hearing both sides, you know, and then making up your own mind about it. So
what was it that really got you to cross that threshold where you gave yourself permission to really look and study beyond what the church was handing you?
It was the passing of a really, really close family member, and I just thought, you know, I'm not finding comfort in God or in Jesus. Like, let me just look into the plan of salvation a bit more. Maybe understand it.
So kind of the promised blessings of comfort and peace of mind that they were saying would come to you just never came. And it was like, well, something's not adding up.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you know, you kind of look further into it. And I guess it's kind of like a whole, you know, feelings like who's still to whom and how does it work if they remarry and have more kids. Like, if there were too many things that I guess the church claims to have all the answers, but also doesn't at the same time. And that's like cognitive dissonance to me, that it's like, well, you can't tell me that I really will be with that person forever. And also, if I don't follow these rules, God's going to keep me away from them. I don't agree with that, and I don't think God would want that or do that, and that's just my opinion and my view right now. And if it is all true, then I guess it will all get worked out in the wash. But as for right now, that's kind of what I did. I thought to give myself permission to just look at it a little bit more critically. So,
it's interesting that you hear so many people describe it that way, where you give yourself permission to look at information that it's like, why do I need permission to read and to be curious and to investigate things yourself? And that's one of those realizations that's the type of control they had over your mind. And it always sounds foreign when somebody says, oh, your brain was controlled or you were brainwashed or anything like, but that's kind of how you experience it, where you've created boxes and protected spaces, even in your own experience in your own mind, that you're not allowed to go into because of this external organization telling you.
And that's pretty true, because I know a lot of people, it's a lifestyle. Sorry, my baby.
No, that's okay.
It's a lifestyle, and it's kind of hard to go against the grain.
Yeah.
But I feel like because I'd already done it once before, because being a convert, I was like, well, you know, it's not okay to not have all the sides of a story and make a decision, especially if you're not happy. Like, people who are happy in a religion, great.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to take anything away from them. You know, I don't really share too much about my friends. So anyway, I think it's time for me to pop off and put those aside.
All right.
But I really appreciate you listening and having a chat.
Well, thank you for calling in. I hope he's feeling better. All right. Well, hopefully that audio worked okay. All right. So I've decided apparently to get smoke in my eye from ribs, but that's okay. All right. So let's see here. So the number you can call if you'd like to share some of your thoughts is 210-422-2222. You know, one of the things she talked about was gaslighting. And it's interesting because in the discussion with Brian Hales on this question of polyandry, I was able to bring up, you know, it's very reasonable for people to think that Joseph committed polyandry because you have church historian thinking itself. And his response was the historian was talking even before he read my book. And so apparently the church historians have also been gaslighted. You're on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Wonderful. This is Leslie. I'm calling in. I find this discussion so
Hey, Leslie. It's great to hear your voice.
Yes, thank you. Well, yeah, so I have so many thoughts. I jotted down a few, and the last two callers were wonderful at really providing insight and getting some questions out there. But I do find myself wondering, you know, if God did intend, going back to the polygamy, polyandry piece, if God did intend, you know, for that to be practiced, why would he have to use such spiritually abusive, coercive language that was later, you know, to be canonized in Scripture? And I apologists, and you probably heard this too, I've heard apologists say that, well, it's really not, you know, abusive. Of course, it can come across that way to a layman who's reading it for the first time, referring to Section 132. But actually, the woman has a choice. You know, there's this caveat in there that if she doesn't consent, then the whole thing's off. And I mean, going back to your point, it's really mind control. Do they really have a choice? You know, if they are threatened with their life, and if there is like you know, it's a patriarchy, it's a hierarchized sort of like abuse community where the priesthood holders are choosing, and they are really the ones that, you know, are making the rules and then enforcing the rules. So do women really have a choice? You know, does the wife really have a choice? I would say no. That's not free choice, free agency.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because the church has gone away from holding up the term free agency as the descriptor for what God has given us on the earth. And David Bednar is the authority who's really gone out there and spearheaded the effort to change the vocabulary of the church. We don't have free agency. What we have is moral agency. And that is that we've been given the opportunity to choose to obey. And so I think this is a response to people like yourself who are accurately pointing out this is not free agency. What we see in Doctrine and Covenants section 132 is a sham if you're trying to describe that as free will, because it's absolutely coercion. And I mean, you can't simply say that because somebody has a choice, then that constitutes free will. Because if somebody points a gun at you and says, give me your wallet, you still have a choice. You could choose not to give them your wallet, but then you're choosing to put yourself in mortal danger. So you've been given the opportunity to choose between your life or handing over a wallet, and that's the whole point of having a gun pointed at you, to get you, coerce you to follow their will. Well, it's the same sort of thing. It's just a spiritual coercion that we have described in section 132. And, you know, the question that I always am fascinated to hear, particularly from women in the church, but also from even, you know, my brothers or anyone that I can get to talk about it, is when you were a completely believing member of the church, how did you wrestle with this reality in section 132? Did you see that paradox of agency where it sounds like you have a choice, but if you refuse, then he can do it anyway and you're going to be destroyed? It's like, Leslie, how long were you a believing member in the church as a grown woman who, you know, like I was? I thought that I was a critical thinker and that I was a moral person, but it wasn't really until I left the church that I realized how deceived I was. How long had you been in the church, and how
Yeah.
did you wrestle with that as a woman who was in the believing frame of mind?
Yeah, it goes back to I have this memory of even my parents kind of having this discussion in front of me, and my mom. I mean, when I was a teenager, and I remember learning about this in Young Women's, and even my mom, said, "I am not okay with this," and this is, like she did not like it, but she loved her community, and I was the same way, and I think that a lot of times, going back to the previous caller and kind of what you were saying about mind control, we don't allow ourselves. Like, that was something that I just kind of put on myself, and I really didn't allow myself to think about it in a way that would have caused me to question it. It was something that I did not agree with. I did not like it. In fact, the first time I read Section 32, I was absolutely horrified. But did I identify it as spiritually abusive and coercive? No, because I didn't have that language. Again, we're not taught that. We don't learn about coercion, about abuse, definitely not about spiritual abuse. And and so I think that one of the trends that I see is I feel like the churches, there's a lot of a push for the community and just awareness nowadays, learning about healthy relationships. With the Me Too movement, that kind of ushered in some of the more awareness that people are coming to in regard to what constitutes a healthy relationship, what constitutes a healthy person, what kind of things do they not do, what is dangerous, what is abusive. And I see the church sort of grappling with, okay, yeah, we want to define abuse, we want to define coercion, we want to define these things, but not too much, because if we define it too much, it's going to go right back to Joseph Smith. And that is
exactly.
It's like a weird, it's like a teeter-totter paradigm that I see them having, like almost within their own policy, right? They have, they've relaxed the temple sealing and the temple wedding policy, where you can, first get married civilly, and there's, not this waiting period, because that was really kind of spiritually abusive when people couldn't see you get married and you came from a part member family. The church has recognized that. Who knows if that was the real reason why? But
yeah, I think when they made that change, they didn't come out and say, "Well, we've come to realize that our prior policies have been abusive and have exploited family marriages to try to compel people to be members of the." I don't think they had any of that insight, but they knew that that's what people were really wanting, and that people had identified it as a problem. There's something about what you're talking about that I really value, in that there really is a process of, it's almost like an education on moral principles that goes on when you learn what something that is abusive is. And it's kind of like, we all grow up and we get into relationships with people, and there are times where someone will get into a relationship with somebody who is abusive, but that person is naive to what those red flags are. And so there's this phenomenon where you'll have somebody who's kind of like the classic narcissist abusive person. And if he or she gets into a relationship with somebody who is aware of those red flags and is able and educated and self-assured enough to draw boundaries, well, then that relationship is going to fall apart, because they'll be abusive and this one will say, "Fuck that shit, I'm out of here." And so then that cycle will happen again until that pairing comes up with somebody who's naive. And they'll be abusive, and part of that abuse almost always has blame shifting. And so this person will perceive that abuse, and they'll start to blame themselves. Oh, the reason this is working, the reason I'm receiving this abuse is because I'm not good enough, I'm not whole enough, I'm not what I should be. And so rather than them drawing an appropriate boundary and saying, "Fuck that shit, I'm out of here," they have to try harder, and they have to be harder. And that paradigm that you can see in interpersonal relationships is also a shadow of our relationship with the church. Anytime there's a problem, if you read D&C 132, if you read what Joseph Smith did in the past, and you don't know that those are red flags of inherently abusive and unhealthy and just terribly unethical and immoral things, then you start to shift that blame to yourself. Oh, the problem is me, that I'm not okay with it. I need to find a way to be okay with it. I need to accept the explanations that are being handed by the apologists. And it's that same sort of pattern of abuse. But when, it's always difficult. I think if you look at, for example, a battered spouse who is in that type of abusive relationship, part of getting them to be able to draw healthy boundaries and to protect themselves is imbuing them with this education about what constitutes abuse, what constitutes boundaries that they should feel it is their right to draw up and to maintain. Because many times people don't feel it's their right to have boundaries, particularly in the relationship we have with the church. And it's almost critical that when you're trying to get somebody into a safe position in the context of use, that you have to go through that moral education. And I feel like each of us have had to do that with regards to the church, and weeding through what we learn from church history is being able to educate ourselves into what constitutes abuse, what constitutes manipulation. And once you learn it, you can't stop but seeing it in how the church and its leaders act.
Exactly. It's so interesting that you bring up that point. At a certain time in my life, I was receiving services at a women's outreach center for abuse survivors. And I was attending a support group. This is in a heavily Mormon populated area. And I can tell you, I would say close to 100% of the women in my support group had dealt with spiritual abuse. That is where I really learned, what this is and how abusers, particularly in the church or in any religious community, use that as a mechanism and a form of control to further the abuse. And it's a very tricky thing, because holding on to a testimony while you are learning about how you have been so coerced, so abused in the name of your religion, of your spirituality, is a very, that was really kind of the tipping point for me. When I could start to identify it, then you see it in our canon, you see it, in other places, and that's just difficult. It's just hard.
Yeah. I can't imagine having to go through dealing with both of those dimensions at the same time, in terms of interpersonal abusive relationships and the inherent spiritual abuse that goes along with how the church relates to individuals. But the one thing that, for me, makes it even more difficult, I think, you're in a position where somebody that you're in an interpersonal relationship, it's almost like they latch on to those parts of the church which give people power that they can then exploit in their interpersonal relationships. And so you'll hear stories of the tyrannical father who justifies his abusive actions in his family with the notion that he is the patriarch, he is the priesthood holder. And that phrase, I'm the priesthood holder, can be used to justify so many things that you would not accept in any other relationship. And that is, it's weird that is a very common thing. I think when you get together with other former Mormons and you hear the stories of what other people and their families put up with, in some instances, I was like, I had no idea people were going through that level of spiritual abuse in their own families.
Right.
But I know you've worked with a lot of people that have had, spiritual trauma and that type of thing. I mean, do you see that? How common is it in Mormon culture?
I see that all the time. I was just talking to a friend who, her father was a mission president, and she said that had even happened in her own family when he was a mission president. Horrific justification of abuses done to her, and I think, it all ties back to Joseph Smith, right? We think that this is how I view that situation now, is I view him as, Emma did not want to practice polygamy. She did not want to enter into these kind of relationships within her marriage, which she has every right to do. Right? As a woman, she should have every right to say, I'm not comfortable with my partner doing this.
Yeah. And
then for them to negotiate that. Instead, he came back with a very coercive, spiritually abusive revelation, is what he called it, and made her do it anyway, pretty much. And so, yeah, it's just very interesting, and it's just to I guess, the ways that the church permits us or encourages us to put restrictions on ourselves. I remember when I was really, in the church, I was walking with a friend and we were talking about polygamy, and it's kind of like this red herring with women in the church that nobody really likes it. Like it bothers everybody, and we don't really talk about it that much. And some of us do, when we're kind of with our friends. But we were talking about it one day, and she said she didn't really like it, and I remember her saying to me, "But I just think about it a little bit, but I don't allow myself to think about it a lot." Like,
Yeah.
And it was just that statement, like, I don't allow myself to really think about it.
Yeah.
And that's always stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very common theme when I ask people, women in particular, how did you deal with Section 132 when you were a believing member? And a lot of it is just, I avoided it. I just, I didn't want to go to any lessons that were about it. And when I was reading scriptures, I just skipped right over it. It was like a black hole that I did not want to see. It's funny too, because there's a couple, Kirk and Lindsay Van Allen, who a few years ago wrote a blog post that kind of caught fire, where they just went through and they said, we're not going to avoid it, we're not going to skip it. And this was, I think they were believing members at the time, but they had just like suddenly woken up to its abusive nature, and they went through just verse by verse and really broke it down in a way that was really, really compelling. So much so that Brian Hales had to publish a response to their blog post, doing the usual sort of spin that comes from a defender of the church. And I just remember waking up to the reality of, it's kind of like if you have a brother or a sister who you see is in an abusive relationship, and then you're trying to help them see the abuse, to understand it so that they can wake up and draw boundaries for themselves. And then somebody else comes in and starts defending the actions of the abuser. And you're like, why in the world, like, how can you in good conscience do that? And that's kind of how I started seeing a lot of the apologetics that are tossed around about Joseph Smith, is to the extent that anyone is willing to defend his actions on some things, particularly around polygamy, they're willing to defend just the most egregious abuses that we would not want to see anyone defend in any other religious charlatan. Why are we okay with it in terms of Joseph Smith?
Right. It is, really unbelievable when you come to learn about that, and then you can kind of see it reflected in the teachings, in the scriptures, even in the community, with, extremely uninformed and unrighteous leaders even.
Yeah.
It's just, I was talking with Bryce months ago, but
You're talking about Bryce
Mormonism.
Blankenagel? Okay.
Yes. And we were talking about Emma and how the church put their own spin on her. And, I pointed out the fact that I think it's very possible that Emma suffered from severe trauma, obviously spiritual trauma, betrayal trauma from having a partner, go astray in these ways. And, that causes a lot of behaviors, a lot of upset in one's life. And the church kind of hung her out to dry, so to speak. I think that they kind of use her as this motif for, this faithful wife, things like that. But they don't really. And he was able to point out so many situations where they kind of slighted her, in fact. And it was so interesting. He would be a great one for you to speak with on this. But they kind of have not addressed that situation either with Emma. And I think Emma, in talking to him more and researching a little bit more about her, she was a remarkable woman, very strong, very independent-minded, very savvy. She, I think that she kind of knew who she was married to, and a lot of Joseph's flaws. And she was able to kind of look at a bigger picture in terms of her own survival and her own independence. And I think that that's just a really interesting, the church does not really paint her in that way unless it kind of fits their narrative.
It almost seems like there's a little bit of a balancing power where, the church could make a really, really good example of her as the devoted, trusting, loving wife who, even through hardship and personal pain, stood by Joseph's side. But in order for them to make the strongest case for that, they would have to really, really be honest about all of the abusive, deceptive, manipulative stuff that Joseph did. And they can't quite do that.
Yeah. Right.
They had to be like, she was willing to stay married to him, even though he was secretly sealed to like 20 women before she was sealed to her. And that would make her really, really devoted. But then you'd have a lot of women saying, so that's what I'm being compared to. Like, in order for me to aspire to be as good as a chosen woman like Emma, I have to be willing to put up with crap like that. And that's not a good pattern to set.
Right. They sort of pedestalize her in a way, and then they definitely like her in many other ways that are subtle, that maybe the normal Mormon, the typical Mormon wouldn't really recognize. But he was kind enough to point so many of those out, which was astounding to me, really. And it kind of reveals how they truly feel about her, I think. And even when she did try to assert her opinion and kick against the pricks a little bit, namely with things that her husband wanted her to do and poor decisions that he was making and that she got wrapped up in fixing and things like that. I just, it is very, very eye-opening. And that's something that the church has really, really whitewashed. I mean, we talk about whitewashing history. That is a part of it that's huge. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate your call. This is a subject that always is good to talk to people about. So many people have different perspectives on it. And I don't know if you were watching the show before the whole coronavirus thing. We had a faithful, believing member of the church come on and explain how she was able to learn the history of Joseph and the different types of proposals that he made, but was still able to see him as a prophet of God. And there's going to be a follow-up episode because I got her to do a bullet point list of exactly what those rationales were. And if you apply those same rationales to anybody else, you would find yourself excusing the unexcusable. And the only thing that holds together is the notion that Joseph Smith is actually a prophet. And that's the thing, is that's a presupposition that people make. You have to come to the table all assuming that without question, because if you allow that to be part of the question, then everything falls apart, because you see that all of these other religious charlatans who have done these unorthodox sexual practices that are manipulative and abusive, they all also hinge on the idea that they are actually a real true prophet. And and you just can't, it's really hard to go through that process of moral education where you understand what abuse is and you realize that these types of abuses and manipulations define the abuser. And so anyone who claims to be a prophet, that's all well and good, but as soon as they start doing these things, they are defining themselves as an abuser. And if you say, and when they make God the author of the abuse, then you've got to really, really question the entire proposition. And that's what Joseph did, particularly in things like the happiness letter.
Yeah, and I think that the preponderance, the term preponderance comes to mind, because when people go in already assuming that he's a prophet of God and that his word is truth, you are not able to correctly preponder the quality of whatever evidence you're looking at. You're not able to say, okay, yeah, he's using spiritually abusive language. You say, no, that's from God, that's scripture.
Yeah.
And so you're already coming with a colored lens.
Yeah, totally agree. All right. Anyway, that would be really good sometime in the future if we have a chance to talk on that particular subject. If you're open to it, it'd be great to have you share some of your experience working with trauma and abuse victims and looking at Joseph's history through that lens.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
All right. Thanks for the call, Leslie.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. All right. So let's see. We're right up past an hour. I think I have to, let me see how much time is left before I have to, I'm doing the 3-2-1 method on ribs, if anyone knows what that is. My phone is now overheated, so my alarm's not going to go off. So I'm going to go ahead and close it down. Thanks for joining us a little bit for this discussion today. And until next time, this is Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.